Good evening, everyone. It's an honour and a pleasure to stand before you and to present for you a presentation around this particular subject. It is an area I have been interested in an extremely long time. I'm interested in what happened to the musket after they finished their service life with those who were originally using them. So this is really the story of the India patent musket, from its birth, where did it come from, through its use, bringing in its use within Luxembourg, and then beyond, because it has a worldwide, it's got a worldwide impact, which is really where I want to talk about. So, okay, let's kick on. During the first half of the 19th century, amongst all the various arms deployed throughout the armies of Europe, there was probably only two extremely iconic muskets that were used. This was particularly true for the wars against Napoleon and the French state. One of these particular muskets was the French model 1777, otherwise known as the model Year 9, or indeed its other name, Charleville musket. And the other, of course, was the British India pattern musket, the subject of what we are going to talk about today. It has a more common name, which you will have all, I'm sure, heard of, which is the Brown Bess. It's not necessarily associated specifically with this. It covers a much broader range of muskets issued to the British Army. But I will occasionally drop into the words or the name Brown Bess. Both of these particular muskets would see a long service throughout the early 19th century, and indeed not necessarily only in the country of their birth, and that's why this is important. This talk, though, is really going to be about the story of the development of this particular musket, the India pattern, its birth, its deployment, its history, and I suppose its impact, as it was not exclusively in British service. Britain's use of this particular musket would finish in reality in about 1838, with the introduction into the service of my state of the percussion system. So the flintlock systems were consigned to history. An example of one in use. This is also going to be the story of the British government's response to what we would often refer to as an urgent need for small arms to fight the French. Because when Britain went to war with the French in 1793, spare muskets were in extremely short supply. The master furbisher, he who was in charge of supplying these things, informed the Board of Ordnance at the time that there were only 5,356 muskets in store at the end of October 1793. Even by 1802, there were only 177,000 muskets available for use. Urgent supplies were going to be needed. Today, in military terms, we would term this as an urgent operational requirement, or UOR, the sort of process that governments, British ones in particular, would use to govern the issue of urgently needed equipment quickly for use by their troops. And this is particularly true of the recent, well, not that recent nowadays, conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. The British had to roll out lots and lots of new types of equipment in response to the different battlefield conditions which were available. So, in that year, 1793, 1794, 10,000 muskets were ordered from a Monsieur Lassance of Liège, and an attempt was made to expand the production in one of the great centres of arms making, which was Birmingham. At the same time, it was decided to approach the East India Company to purchase stocks of what was known as the India pattern musket. I don't intend to give you an exhaustive history of the weapon itself, otherwise known as the Brown Bess musket. That has been exhaustively covered by many different people in many different publications. But it is suffice to say that there were two specific versions of this particular India pattern musket. One which was adopted in about 1797, this one here, and it is characterized by what we refer to as a swan neck cock, and an improved version which came into service in around 1809, and this one has a much more reinforced cock, because that particular swan neck was identified as a point of weakness. It was an improved design. In fact, the majority of the ones which we would produce would in fact be this second version. As a model, particular model, it is characterized by 39-inch, a 991mm barrel, a bore roughly of a 0.75 of an inch, that's 19 to 20 millimeters, otherwise known in the bore world as an 11 bore, and it had a relatively plain walnut stock mounted with brass furniture. The French musket, the model 1777, on the other hand, had a much longer and larger barrel at 1100 millimeters, with a smaller caliber of 17.5 millimeters. This is not to say one was better than the other. They both indeed represent different sides of the same coin. But what I would want to do this evening is to explore for you the context around the development of this particular musket, the India pattern, its adoption, its use, and more pertinent to today, what happened to all those muskets. And there were a huge number of them made, both during and after the wars against Napoleon. For instance, how did they end up in the hands of the Luxembourg Federal Contingent? Before I start my story, you might find it interesting to know why Britain went to war. Firstly with revolutionary France, and then with Napoleon's imperial France. Well, William Pitt, more popularly known as William Pitt the Younger, was the then Prime Minister. His father was also Prime Minister. He was William Pitt the Elder. Set out the reasons for war in his first war speech, which he set out in Parliament in 1793, a mere 5 years after the seismic revolutions that took place in France. And he said, and I'm going to quote this, "England will never consent that France shall arrogate the power of annulling at her pleasure and under the pretence of a natural right of which she makes herself the only judge, the political system of Europe established by solemn treaties and guaranteed by the consent of all powers. The goals that Britain is now setting out to seek on the battlefield is to maintain the balance of power in Europe and to ensure that the sanctity of international agreements are upheld." That's the reason why Britain went to war. This meant that Britain could not accept the spread of revolution, nor could indeed many of the other states of Europe. Revolution was what was being suggested by revolutionary France at the time. So, to the musket in question and its role in this noble cause. The story in this case starts in India, with the need to supply and arm a private military force maintained by the British East India Company. This was a sizable armed force, consisting of both an army, actually there were 3 armies. They were based on the 3 company residencies, as they were referred to in India, and their old names being Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, now known as Mumbai, Kolkata, and I've got to get this one right, Chennai. And of course, there was a navy. In fact, the East India Company maintained armies at this time far larger than the peacetime British Army itself. Therefore, as a company which had such a sizable armed force, they had to design and had manufactured its very own arms, muskets, pistols, swords, cannon, etc. All of these things were made for this particular company. And ones specifically and particularly suitable for service in India. And almost all of these were going to be made by the gunsmiths of Birmingham. So, by the end of the 18th century, the musket that the East India Company troops were supplied with was one originally designed by General Stringer Lawrence, who was the commander-in-chief of the Madras Army. His dates, by the way, were 1698, and he died in 1775. And they were designed for company service specifically. It was then altered and simplified by someone known as Lieutenant Colonel Edward Windus in 1771. And it is this particular form that he simplified the musket to that would see service both in India with the company's armies and subsequently with the British Army. So they remained in service in India from 1771 right through to the introduction of the percussion system in India in 1823. The East India Company armies were always ahead of the British King's Army in terms of new equipment coming in. So the musket in question, there is Mr. Pitt, the younger, and this is the musket in question, the Windus. It looks exactly the same, and that is the one that was adopted. They were manufactured in England, in Birmingham, as I said, and then they were put into the stores of the East India Company outside, just outside London, on the River Thames. In their company service, it was known as the Windus pattern, after Colonel Windus. It was shorter, lighter than the contemporary British Army musket, which was 42 inches in length of the barrel, and but still had the same bore, and was particularly suitable for use by both the company's European troops and its Indian troops. That was the justification for having a much shorter barreled musket. In all, the East India Company would order in excess of 650,000 of these muskets. But the number is far larger than their need, because they sold many onto the board, or to the Board of Ordnance for use by the British Army. In fact, they sold around 130,000 of these muskets. And it's quite interesting to look at the financial picture as well, because it's worth seeing what they actually cost, as each new musket which the East India Company purchased cost them roughly, well, not roughly, actually 29 shillings. What does that mean today? Well, in euro terms, that's roughly 1,200 euros. As a private company, when they sold these to the British government, who were desperate for the musket, it would be sold on to the British government for 31 shillings, roughly 1,400 euros. A reasonable profit. A profit, in fact, of 2 shillings. As a private company, why wouldn't you? That's what you're in the business for, making profit. So I'll make profit on the fact that the British Army required something urgently. But in 1795, the Ordnance began to see that this particular pattern, the India pattern, was worthwhile, and so it began to order on its own account examples of these. And by 1797, it was adopting the musket officially as a particular model. It was known as the India pattern, but we now in the 20th, 21st century, when we do our modelling, you know, which models of weapons are they, we refer to it as the model 1793 India pattern. That doesn't mean that in the days when it was in use, that's what it was known as. It was known as an India pattern. And they began to place substantial orders for it with the Birmingham gun trade. And you can see the similarities with all these, the windows through 1797 to 1809, and the different shapes for the locks, the swan necks through to the ring necks or the reinforced cock. Having first purchased these muskets in 1794, the government realised that these were ideal as an emergency issue, which is what they were doing. And as I said earlier, they adopted it in 1797, with the government now contracting directly with the Birmingham gun trade to produce these muskets. It was, though, hard for the government to place these orders with the trade, as the trade preferred to work with the East India Company. Why? Because they were better payers. They actually paid their invoices on time. The government, like many governments around Europe at this time, were notorious for late payment. But in the end, quantity would win them over. The requirement was significant. The British would produce between 1795 and 1815, roughly 20 years, nearly 3 million of these India pattern muskets. And as a side note, it is interesting to note that the average price that the government would pay the trade for this model, which they were placing orders for, was roughly 18 shillings and 5p, roughly €1,000 in today's money. Much cheaper than they were paying for the East India Company to purchase theirs. This is not surprising because they were ordering in bulk and they could then drive a significant bargain. Today, to put some context on this, if we are buying new standard military rifles to issue to our troops today, we are talking around about 6, 7, 8,000 euros per rifle. So in those days, it was quite cheaper. And it's not actually that surprising because in societal terms, labour was significantly cheaper. It's an axiom, really. In the past, labour is cheap and raw materials are expensive. Today, raw materials seem to be cheaper, but labour is significantly more expensive. It's just one of those weird things. In all, and it's worth thinking about, the British would invest, in today's terms, roughly £390 million in producing muskets. That's roughly 450 million euros. And over this 20-year period. But this is rather an odd figure. It's difficult to get your head around because the British Army was never greater than 250,000 men. So what were the majority of these muskets for? And where did they go? Bearing in mind that the average service life of one of these muskets, and we know this from records, was 12 years. So even if every single soldier would replace his musket once, there was only ever going to be a need for 500,000 muskets. So clearly, the British made the excess for a particular purpose. And what was that? Before I address that particular question, I would like to just explore how we made them, how we stored them, and how we moved them around. As I mentioned earlier, most of these muskets were made in Birmingham. Some were made in London, but majority were made in Birmingham. and they were made under what is known at the time as the ordnance system, which is particularly English, which was essentially the subcontracting of manufacture from the National Armoury, then based in my old place of work, the Tower of London, to the commercial firms of Birmingham. And there would naturally, of course, be built within this a profit incentive. This is markedly different to how the French would manufacture their muskets, which were produced in national armories, ones such as Charleville or Saint-Étienne. There were about 8 or 9 particular armories that they manufactured these for the French. The ordnance system set out that the components were to be made by many, many small workshops, and then they would assemble them into some major components by some contractors, who in turn then pass these major bits, maybe a lock or a barrel, onto what is referred to as finishers or setters up, either at the Tower of London itself or with one of the main contractors. There are about half a dozen of those. The government would then agree to accept the finished article. They would inspect it. They would agree that it was met a certain standard. They would affix a particular government ownership stamp, and you will have all probably seen such a thing. The broad arrow surmounted by a crown, which tells us that that particular musket was accepted into British service and is owned by the British government. And that becomes important subsequently. As I said, it's in complete contrast with how the French made theirs, which were in these large state factories. The process of setting up was a series of 4 particular manufacturing and viewing inspection steps that put the weapon together. These included rough stocking, screwing together, and making off, i.e. what these mean is basically you're completing and finishing that musket. There were at this time roughly around 400 suppliers in Birmingham and its small surrounding towns and villages that made up this particular process. And these were feeding into, as I said, about half a dozen to 8 particular main contractors. In 1804, we went back to war again, and to meet this growing demand, a degree of mechanization was going to be needed. And this meant the use of powered machinery, which was going to be essential. So in a way, the gun-making industry in Birmingham was going to power up, if you wish, the Industrial Revolution in Britain. By 1811, one company, just one company, was able to produce 10,000 barrels a month by the use of a 120 horsepower steam engine. It just enabled material to be churned out at greater and greater numbers. To speed up the manufacture, contractors started to use such machines as drop hammers, grinders, and wood turners. And as a consequence, gun-making became one of the engines of the Industrial Revolution. This is a slightly older image, but you can see that this is a barrel boring machine. It has been run by a steam engine, which is behind that wall, and they were able to turn out significant numbers. Birmingham would be itself responsible for nearly 2.2 million of the 3 million muskets made. The rest were going to be supplied either by the gunmakers of London or indeed the one at this time government factory, which is based in Lewisham in South London. The Birmingham trade itself rose to this challenge to supply the number of weapons required during the war. The trade was able to increase production from an estimated capacity of 3,000 muskets a week in 1794 to in excess of 14,000 a week in 1803, and subsequently maintain that rate of manufacture. So, once made and accepted for government service, these muskets, or as they are referred to in original documentation at the time, as a stand of arms, which meant that the musket in question included its sling, its bayonet, and the bayonet scabbard. These had to be moved around, so they were packed in crates, usually 20 to a crate. Oops. And these crates then had to be transported to a depot. The most efficient way of doing this was by the new motorways of the period, known as canals. And by 1805, the canal system in Britain was extensive and had been designed to assist the efficient flow of goods, not only around the country, but specifically and more importantly to the ports. Britain is a maritime country. It lived at this time and relied on international trade. So the ports had to be fed with stuff. And the canals were what was going to get them to it. This is long before the introduction of the railway system, which was another 30 years yet to come. And this gives you an idea of the extent of the canal system. It's a difficult map to read, but I've indicated where London and Birmingham is, and that's how we would move stuff around. They would play a key part in the industrialization of Britain, and in the case of firearms specifically, these crates took a 100-mile journey down what is known as the Grand Junction Canal to the new Central Ordnance Store at a place called Weedham Beck, which was based in Northamptonshire. There's your nice Grand Union Canal with a boat carefully being pulled along. It would be from here, this particular ordnance store, that the muskets would be issued from. The arms and gunpowder would then be subsequently flowed down the canal system to London in particular, and then down the River Thames, and from there to the Thames magazines, where they would be stored, waiting to go to wherever they were going to go. This is Weedon itself. The building of Weedon Beck demonstrates exceptionally well the strategic decision that was taken in 1802 by the British government to create the first major ordnance establishment in Britain to be built far inland in a very central location where it was well connected by both the canal system and the road system. It was intended to receive efficiently and store securely and to dispatch promptly muskets, field ordnance and gunpowder, not only around Britain, but around the world. The purpose of putting it into the centre of Britain was the inevitable fear that we always had of French invasion. So this is the layout of the stores. The depot, when it was fully operational, was capable of holding 200,000 muskets at any one time in specially built storehouses. And it continued to be in use well into the 1960s. And there you have it. It has hardly changed. It's the same storehouses built on the same canal system, although by now, 1965, we were not moving material around on the canal system. We were using the train system and the road system. Prior to 1802 and the building of this particular Central Ordnance Centre in Weedon, there were 5 particular ordnance establishments which were either manufacturing or storing the country's major reserves of arms, ammunition and gunpowder, all in a relatively small area around the Thames estuary. And the government had always considered that these would be at risk of being destroyed or captured if Napoleon invaded. Hence, an inland depot was built. Britain, as I said, has always feared that invasion. And in fact, we built defences all along the south coast to try and mitigate any possible invasion. You can see remnants of it above Dover. There's a staircase that goes from the upper, from where the castle is, all the way down to where the port is now. And it's a contra-rotating staircase which allowed troops to move from the barracks above all the way down. And that's the sort of level of fear that was at the time. So here you have a bit of a map, just gives you an impression of where all these things are. Tower of London, the centre, that is the headquarters of the Board of Ordnance, and also where we also issued weapons from. Waltham Abbey above it was a powder manufactory. Actually, I'll go back and just Tower of London. Yeah, the Woolwich Warren at the bottom left, which is otherwise known as Woolwich Arsenal from about 1805, was the manufacturing and storing both artillery and ammunition. Faversham powder mills just off the map manufactured powder. Waltham Abbey, the Royal Gunpowder Factory, also produced gunpowder, and the Purfleet and Tilbury magazines were designed to hold all the weapons prior to dispatch to wherever they were going. So, to revert back to the question which I was intending to answer, which is, why did Britain make so many muskets? It is worth remembering that by 1802, Britain was probably the wealthiest nation on earth, and as a consequence was able to both subsidise and supply its allies in Europe, and this included arms and equipment. Britain would not put an army onto the continent till 1807 in Portugal and then subsequently in Spain. And the following slides I'm going to show you give you an idea of the number of states which Britain supported and roughly how much money was given by Britain, along with the numbers of muskets we also supplied. There we go. That's the significant, at least there are maybe 20 to 30 other in total. All the little German states will be classified as a separate state. Which is why the list is a little smaller. And in terms of the numbers of muskets, and bear in mind that the top 5 were the guys who were carrying a war against Napoleon. So, Portugal, that's where we landed and we started fighting, the Brits started fighting Napoleon's troops in Spain. Spain itself. Russia carried the war against Napoleon for a long time on its own. Prussia, in fact, at one point we agreed to pay Prussia £1 million a year for every 100,000 troops they put in the field. And of course, Austria. We supplied them with arms and equipment as well. To give you an idea of total quantity of money that we expended in 2026, money, it's on the left-hand side, in grand total, nearly £5 billion was expended in supporting various allies in Europe. Also, as an aside, between 1793 and 1815, we also loaned our allies nearly £66 million. We expected to get some money back, and most of the time we did. This sort of level of support for allies would not be seen again until the enactment probably of Lend-Lease by the American Congress in 1941. And again, subsequent to the end of the Second World War, what was known as the Marshall Plan in 1946. That's the sort of level which Britain was able to put forward to its allies. So when talking about money, it is also worth noting that the 100 Days War, the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Waterloo, just 100 days, would cost Britain £20 million in money terms back then. The aid to allies was mostly in cash, or as it was referred to at the time, and it's quite interesting because different words are used. We called it specie. It basically means money, to fund troops for the battlefield. And we also supplied the arms, the equipment, the clothing and the gunpowder. There we go. Which one am I? Yep. So that's an idea of the quantity of muskets which we supplied to these various people. Right. Okay. I'm going to move on to something else. So if the British were supplying all of these muskets to our allies, how did we manage to get them into the hands of those who needed to use them? The answer to this question, in order to answer this question, we need to turn our attention to a very small island in the North Sea, one known as Heligoland. There it is, it's tiny. The capture and occupation of this island of Heligoland in September 1807, and we captured it from the Danes, was a key event, as it meant that this small island would become a key asset for Britain in her proxy war against Napoleon. There you are. That's an image of the time. It would serve a number of purposes with Heligoland. It would become a central depot for the supply of arms into northern Germany and into the Baltic, a headquarters for Britain's spying operations in Europe, and a key player in facilitating the smuggling of finished goods, which would enable Britain to break the continental blockade that Napoleon had placed upon Britain, and to try in an attempt to deny British access to European markets. Among the most important products that were smuggled were coffee, sugar and tobacco, all products produced in the British Empire. It was the continent's love of these products in particular that broke the blockade. Marx and Engels, in one of their works, Werk, Volume 3, would subsequently declare that Napoleon had lost the war because the Germans love a sugar and coffee. As an example, in 1811, 11 million pounds of coffee was smuggled into Germany via Heligoland. But more importantly for this particular story, the island also enabled Britain to support those states ready to rise against Napoleon through what is known as the Guineas and Gunpowder Programme. That is, arms supplied, subsidies, covert operations, and targeted expeditions. Heligoland was key to this particular policy. And here's a map of Heligoland. You can see where the town and the harbour is. Incidentally, as a side note, it's interesting that Heligoland was also the site of one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in 1945-46, when the British blew up the stocks of German munitions which they brought back from northern Germany and stored on Heligoland. As a consequence, the centre of Heligoland is a big crater. From the island where Britain was able to run networks of informants and agents onto the continent, direct covert operations, conduct counterintelligence operations, orchestrate pro-British propaganda, and organise the transport of troops to and from the continent. The island was a principal recruiting station for what is known as the British King's German Legion, those men of German descent who would serve in the British Army, and the King's German Legion played quite an important role at the Battle of Waterloo. the smuggling of arms and the channeling of secret payments to allies and insurgents, and this would be done via sympathetic bankers in Hamburg, such as Parish & Co., which sounds an English name, but they were in fact German. All this was possible because the island was a mere 45 kilometres from the German shore and 70 kilometres from Hamburg. That gave us a huge amount of opportunity. Napoleon on occasion attempted to attack Heligoland, but the Royal Navy had a squadron permanently stationed around it. New storage buildings were erected on the island to hold arms and powder, as well as all the mercantile goods needed to be smuggled into Germany. And the harbour was improved to facilitate all this new traffic. The new storage sheds which they built were able to hold up to 100,000 muskets, all stored in chests, 22 a chest. Once landed in Germany, and to get these muskets to their destination, they were loaded onto wagon trains for dispatch. This is an area we tend to forget. We talk about the politics and the strategy of troops moving around Europe to fight Napoleon. We forget the logistics that are required to make that happen. A good example of what was going on in this particular process would be a plan which was to support a proposed uprising in Hanover in 1809. And the idea was to supply them with 10,000 muskets, which would amount to about 500 chests of muskets and probably about 25 wagon loads. This would include gunpowder and other things. In this particular case, they were landed on the Frisian coast, but the uprising which they were sent to support was aborted, and the guns and ammunition and wagons were abandoned. A French officer who found them reported that he came across a long train of wagons which he proceeded to capture and take custody of. In addition, the British also set up a huge arms depot in the Baltic in about 1810 in Stralsund on the Baltic coast, which would be a very convenient place to supply Prussia, Sweden and Russia. Arms were shipped by ship, and in 1812 170,000 muskets were shipped there. The Russians, on the other hand, preferred to have their arms shipped direct to Riga, 50,000 in 1813, but not all arms reached their port of destination. In 1812, 60,000 muskets were lost at sea during a violent storm off Danzig, and in all, probably around 100,000 were lost at sea. During the spring and summer of 1813, an almost steady stream of transport sailed from England, from the Thames estuary, to the Baltic ports to guarantee that the three great powers, Prussia, Sweden and Russia, lacked for nothing: muskets, flints, gunpowder, cannon, clothing, anything they required, all paid for by the British government. So, having said all that, they supplied all these muskets to the great powers. Napoleon was eventually defeated twice. And what would happen to all these muskets at the end of the wars against the French in 1816? The numbers relating to the India pattern musket at the start of peace in 1815 were quite impressive. We had new muskets, which had been manufactured, 2.5 million. We'd purchased nearly 300,000 in Europe, particularly in Liège and from Hamburg. Quality was a bit dodgy then. In store, or in possession of troops in 1802, we had 177,000. There was a significant quantity in terms of numbers. And subsequently, in 1816, obviously, the British government does what it always does at the end of a war. It cancelled immediately all outstanding contracts for any arms. That's what we do. And anything which had been produced was immediately put into store as unused. And that included many, many unused barrels, just the barrels. So where do we start using these things? Well, there is a worldwide trade for muskets. There are clearly many hundreds of thousands of these things around in Europe, so it would not be surprising, therefore, that the Luxembourg contingent, the Federal Contingent, might well be armed, and we know they were armed, with this particular weapon, as they would have been so numerous in German service, Dutch service, a variety of other services. That's where the sources probably are. Speaking to Ralph, I don't think we know where they came from. They're just there. And that is an example of that of an English musket, as Ralph mentioned at the very beginning. The quantity in 1843, there is a record of 23 of these English muskets being on issue to the Federal Contingent. But they were not the only users of this musket, because they were used worldwide. Particularly Mexico and South America were a rich hunting ground for the musket, and as for surplus British muskets. Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821 under the leadership of Santa Anna. By 1824, Mexico had negotiated with British banks for loans to purchase arms. By 1827, Mexico purchased 110,000 of these Brown Bess muskets, and they were delivered directly to Mexico, along with large quantities of other warlike stores. And they would see service in the Mexican army well into the 1840s. There was also sales of these muskets to other South American emerging nations such as Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and in Peru. And they would see significant service with the troops of these particular nations. It is estimated that between 1815 and 1825, 700,000 muskets and 35 million flints were exported from Britain to the emerging countries of South America. In effect, Britain was arming the independence movements against Spain. And that's an example of the Brazilian one. There's just vaguely possible to make out the crest of Pedro II of Brazil. For Mexico, the Brown Bess musket would see action during the Texas Revolution in 1835, and it even continued in use during the Mexican-American War of 1846, where it was to be outclassed by the American Springfield rifle. Note the word rifle as opposed to musket. It was also used at the Siege of the Alamo in 1836. You are Mexicans at war with the US. Even the merchants of New South Wales and Australia and its new hub of Sydney were trading in India pattern muskets. By 1839, in total, at least 20,000 of these muskets had been traded into New Zealand, mostly in exchange for flax, and mostly into the hands of the Maori tribes. And this trade would fuel what was known in New Zealand as the Musket Wars, an intertribal Maori war. And there's one of them. Clearly well used, it's missing its cock. Although not a large dent in the supply of these muskets, it does demonstrate the reach that the musket had. I have been studying the use of the India pattern musket, or the Brown Bess musket, after Waterloo for many years, and I still find it puzzling how few examples exist in European public collections. And I have really been looking for them. You know, there's 1 million of them were sent into the European mainland. Where do they all go? That is a conundrum I have yet to solve. I'm still searching for that answer, although I now know where 24 of them went, here in Luxembourg. There is one unusual footnote to this story, and I'd like to relate this to you, because I think you'll find it amusing before I finish. In 1820, there were still over 700,000 musket barrels, just the barrels, in store, never having been used to make up a musket. So what could they possibly be used for? The rest of this particular story has yet to be fully verified, but nonetheless it does ring true. They were used in the gas industry. You may wonder what I mean. When London was being fitted for gas lighting in the 1820s, the early gas companies, particularly the City of London Gas, Light and Coke Company, purchased these surplus musket barrels to be used to draw gas from the street mains to individual houses. The London gunsmith, James Russell, adapted these pipes by threading the muzzles, removing the breeches, and then threading the muzzles into the breeches, thus creating a continuous pipe. A musket barrel is designed to take quite high pressure loads, so it should quite easily take the pressure of gas passing through it. That's one of the reasons that they're designed to contain what was then coal gas. This was only ever going to be a temporary fix. The musket barrels were soon replaced by cast iron ones. There is, though, a legacy from this that is still around today. In Britain, the gas industry calls that small pipe that connects your house to the mains in the street a barrel. I do love this story, and I hope that I can prove its truth in time, as it is a wonderful anecdote. And it shows, for me, how warlike stores can be turned to peaceful ends. I would like to finish by thanking Ralph for the very kind invitation to come across and to present for you this talk, which I have enjoyed immensely, and I thank you all for listening to me. And if anyone has any questions, I will be delighted to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this spellbinding masterclass in... Thank you very much, Mark, for this spellbinding masterclass in geography, in history, in material heritage, in logistics, in economical history. I think also for the students that are here, that is what you get when you look at an object in a museum in context. I myself am lost for words because I enjoyed that tremendously, but probably some of you have questions.
Hello, do you know about the brown bass who is in a pub in Fishguard and who dates from the invasion of Fishguard of 1797?
In Fishguard?
In Fishguard, yes.
Yes?
Anyways, do you know that gun?
No, I don't. Not that one.
Okay, you have to go to the...
I need to go and find it, obviously.
It's the... I think it's the Ryle... Something with Ryle. Well, a lot of pubs are Ryle, but in Fishguard not many. The interesting thing with that gun is they say that it's from the invasion, and that allows the invasion of the French on British soil, as you know. And they have two items. They have an original water bottle of a French officer of glass made with leather around it, and a gun. And they said, oh, it's a Charleville. But we looked at it and we said, no, that's not a Charleville. That's a brown bass. But it has capucine on it, which have no use on a brown bass, which is fixed by, we said in that, pins, yes.
Pins, yeah.
So we were thinking about it, what happened, and then we looked for where the troops were coming from, the 5,000 men the French sent, well, mostly from prisons. And they were armed by weapons taken from the island of Quiberon. From the invasion of the island of Quiberon, there were 5,000 guns taken there from the royalists, from the royalist French troops, and they were equipping the rotten troops they sent to Fishguard. Well, why are there capucins on it? And we're thinking, we don't know, that seeing the reglement of 17, wie heißt Reglementsnummer? 1700, merci, nee, Reglementsnummer ist nicht 93. Reglement ist 1777. Yeah. About the regulation of the 1791 regulation of the gun handling, you need the capucin to position your hand to make your right. And we're thinking that eventually these capucins, these fake capucins, were put on for that, but we don't know. Have a look.
I will happily go and have a look.
Thank you. I might have a question too. Yeah. Thank you. My question is, we go to the experts corner.
No, I was always asked myself why they didn't have bands on the brown vest and pins. They have always the pins until the end, and the French had already bands to keep the capucin screws for this. No, the bands.
The bands?
Yes.
No, but because that was the design which came from the East India Company. It was also cheaper, less metal to use. You've got to remember the economics.
Okay.
Hence the cost drops.
Thank you very much.
Ja, skip. Merci. No. Well, some more questions. Shall we
Excellent.
wait for a moment to digest the input and information?
Yeah, richtig. Yeah, we're just talking about the pins again, but it's more complicated to make a gun with pins than one with capucins, because if you make it with pins, you have to put every time a little pin under the
barrel will have little lugs which you put the pin.
That's much more complicated than have a straight one and forget it.
And much more better.
Well, it's what they chose to do. I can't answer that question.
Just in defense of the brown vest, the Federal Contingent did not use the French musket.
Yeah.
Well, it did use the Dutch 1815. But
I would like to ask, how did you come up with this idea?
Because I'm particularly interested, I'm not just interested in the gun, I'm interested in its context, what it did, how it impacted life, society. I wanted to know what happened to them all, because the numbers were extraordinary. What happened? Why do you make so many, and where did they all go? Those are the two fundamental questions.
Okay.
And it's fascinating. I want to know. I still don't know. I want to know. Do you want to help me?
I'm more interested now than at the beginning, so maybe yes.
Oh, that's great. That's a win. I'm happy.
You mentioned these guns ending in New Zealand, for example.
Yeah.
What about China?
We don't have much records. China was a relatively closed society at this time. The East India Company didn't start penetrating China until later. So I don't recall these particular musket being either in Japan or China, but certainly India, yes, obviously. And then places like Malaya, maybe. But no, I'm not aware of any yet. But I wait to find out. It's the start of a journey.
You didn't speak about the African trade. What happened?
On purpose, I have not talked about.
I'm disappointed.
Well. Yes, of course, many of them were used in trade into Africa initially for slaves, obviously, part of the slave trade. It is a fact, that's what happened. And it's interesting to note that the Belgians were still supplying flintlock muskets as late as the 1960s into the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's an extraordinary fact. Yeah. And in fact, muzzle-loading muskets are still quite common in the jungle, because it's so much easier to have some loose powder, some ball, and a tube, rather than trying to find complete cartridges. it's a lot easier. They're much more comfortable with that. So that's why they still have them. But yes, the trade in, clearly the British had an enormous trade into the rest of the world.
Yes,
Africa,
it's the African kingdoms where we're not talking about, and
Yes.
not enough history made yet, but they bought thousands. And
yes, but we
hundreds
traded
of
lots of them.
yeah.
Yes, that's very true.
Good.
But not many of them were actually India patterns. They're what we refer to as trade patterns, a particular type, lesser quality. So one of the things the gun makers did was when they manufactured the musket barrels, many of them failed. They weren't good enough quality. So those lesser quality barrels were then made into trade muskets because Africa didn't matter. Simply put, it did not matter what you sent them. They would take whatever you gave them. So it enabled the gun makers to recycle failed weapons. But they did stamp them erroneously.
So I think to conclude, you come to a talk in Luxembourg and you go out and you've ticked all of the continents through.
Through this one question.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Pleasure.
On behalf of
Absolutely a pleasure. Nice to see you all.